right, happy Wednesday night, everybody. It's your host, Wes Seiler, for the Burke Conservative, and I hope your week is going great. Mine has been awesome. The weather's been sunny. I've had some family over. We had an awesome time just hanging out at the beach and going out to eat, starting to go back to normal, man. It's been awesome. Do have a couple announcements for you. So, the first one here is that I got a chance to be on a fellow YouTuber's show, Don the Plebe. It was a bunch of fun. This was on Sunday. So Sunday night, we had our show, Refounding Fathers, and we had Conservatism on Tap as well. But before I did that, I got to be on Don's show, and it was an awesome interview. So I encourage you to take a look at his YouTube channel, take a look at him on Twitter, follow him there, and you can see our discussion on there. It went for, man, it was like an hour and a half is what we did, and it was a ton of fun. We talked about all kinds of stuff. He is a former Marine, I believe, and so we got to talk military. That's obviously been in the news. That was a lot of fun. Got to give him my perspective on that, and then we got into conservative theory, and honestly, we got into some of the things that I'm going to talk about tonight, which was really great. So he kind of spurred my thought on a few topics that I think you're going to find useful. So let's get into some of that. So I put out a couple posts about this already, and you've seen this picture here of Burke versus Rousseau, and that's what we're going to get into tonight. Is two different thinkers, two different philosophers, and what I want you to see is how it matters for today. Burke, as you know, is the namesake of this channel. He is a guy that we'd love to talk about all the time on all of our shows, and means a lot to me personally. Rousseau is someone we don't talk about that often, but I think he's influential as well. And it really, when you look at these guys, it is more this type of thing where we may latch on to ideas. Things may be common sense to us, but a lot of times we can trace it back to their thought. And most of the time, it's subconscious. You don't even realize that you're doing it, but you're following theories or beliefs that these guys articulated. So much of the modern right and left comes back to these guys in ways that we may or may not understand. So kind of getting into their thought is a lot of fun because it can show us exactly where those beliefs come from. So let's take a look at who Rousseau was. So this is one of those guys who comes up in classes all the time, right? So if you've taken undergraduate philosophy, maybe even high school, they probably told you about this guy. He's considered one of the so-called moderns. Typically what they do in classes, they bring up Rousseau, they'll bring up Locke, and they'll bring up Hobbes. And they'll say, this is where modern political philosophy comes from. Most of our ideas can be traced back to these guys. Almost never will they discuss Burke or any conservative thinker. And there's typically a lot of like affinity for Rousseau. People love him, especially college professors. And if you've had that, you know what I'm talking about. So let me know what your experience was like if he ever came up in some class that you went to, or if you've heard him discuss. If you haven't, no worries. We're going to get into what he believed. And again, I could tell you all the history of like what was going on when he was writing and where he lived and all that stuff. But what really matters for you is what was his belief in, and how does it actually affect the world today? And that's what we're going to focus on right now. So you probably heard this term, noble savage. This is what this guy believed. Is he believed that human beings were born innocent. He believed that if they were left to their own devices, that good would result, that evil came about through civilization, that as societies and cultures built up, that's where the problems really started. That if we could only go back to a time before we had all of this built up in our lives, that things would be better. But unfortunately, we can't. And so we kind of look back on these innocent people who are outside of society. I'm like, man, I wish that was us, because so much of what we deal with today, think about like pollution, think about crime, identity theft, all types of things that are kind of like vices of modern society. Someone like Rousseau would be like, what a shame that is. If only we could go back to nature. This guy, he loved to like just sit on his boat or sit on his dock and just look up at the sky and just forget about being a human being at all. So he kind of prized this innocence that he saw as part of human nature. And He was very much against civilization as an idea. And basically, he got to a point where he believed that if we could simply take civilization and have it listen to the people, that our problems would go down as much as possible, that we deal with less problems in the world. So we just need to get back to that innocence that he found as part of the human being, as opposed to the sophisticated gentleman or lady and the aristocrats of his day. And so there's all these parallels from Rousseau to the left. And honestly, you see this in modern politics as a whole. Is if you think about the way that so many people approach politics today, so much of it is actually kind of coming from Rousseau because we approach things like business, we approach things like government, we look at the problems that happen, and we're so quick to look for victims. We are so quick to say, these poor people are just victims of society, whatever it is that they're dealing with, whatever crisis comes along. These innocent people have no fault of their own, have no responsibility for what's going on, and they're just being crushed by the machine. And so when you look at Rousseau, that's exactly what he was saying. You think about things like the student loan crisis, right? People are just swamped in student loan debt, right? They're being crushed by a machine. That's how the left phrases things as we look at people and we say, oh my goodness, they're dealing with this terrible, terrible tragedy. What can we possibly do? Or whatever. Pick your crisis. You could go into mortgages. You could go into almost any type of burden today. And if the immediate reaction is to say, hey, these people are completely innocent and this thing is just bigger than them, then it comes from Rousseau. And so constantly there is this move by the left, and frankly by many people on the right, to try to reconfigure society, to blame it first of all, and then reconfigure it to try to help people who have no responsibility of their own. So that's Rousseau, and people love him. Now Burke, on the other hand, Burke is very different. Burke, you don't hear about him in colleges hardly at all because Burke was against state of nature theory as an idea. This was a guy who, unlike Hobbes, unlike Locke, unlike Rousseau, said it really doesn't matter how human beings came into existence in terms of how it affects us today. It's confusing, it's shrouded in mystery. I'm not entirely certain, and neither are you. What matters, though, is that we've inherited this civilization, and it's up to us to figure out how to make it work. So, this was a guy who wasn't as focused on these abstractions or these grand plans and ideas of how to remake society perfectly. This was someone in Burke who was more focused on what are we dealing with today instead of trying to perfect things the way that Rousseau was, instead of trying to go back to some superficial state of nature. Burke was saying, let's deal with the country that we have right now. Let's deal with the problems that we have right now. Those are complicated enough, and let's see how we can handle them. So immediately he starts off in a different place. Civilization for Burke wasn't completely corrupt, wasn't the start of everybody's problems, and it wasn't perfectible. Instead, he looked at it as a series of trade-offs. There's good and there's bad with it. As we look at the institutions that have been given to us, some of them need to change. Some of them don't. Some of them are pretty amazing. Some of them we're not sure about, and we need more time. We need to look at them. But it's constantly the series of trade-offs, and we don't always understand what we're going to get when we make a change. The same thing, by the way, with people, is that Burke would say freedom is a great idea. However, for certain people, they may not be able to handle it, while others can. It really depends on their maturity level, their virtue, their manners, all these other things that they may or may not possess. And so human beings, like society and civilization, are a mixed bag of both good and evil, much more sophisticated than Rousseau's thought. And so, what does that leave Burke to, in terms of what does he give us to do? What is Burke calling us to do? And that is to balance and build. Is he didn't accept these simple solutions. He didn't accept the fact that, oh, all these people are victims and that explains everything, which isn't to say that some people haven't had bad luck or haven't had the short end of the stick. There are certainly tragedies. There are certainly people who've been hurt, or things that happen that are not somebody's fault. However, there's always more to the story, and that's what Burke was getting at. He was getting at this notion that, okay, if this person, something bad happens to them, the victimization is part of that. They didn't necessarily need this to happen. They didn't want this to happen. They didn't deserve for this to happen. However, what can that person do to overcome it? Because seeing them purely as a victim is someone who's powerless. They're reactionary. This is the person, this is the object. When Burke said, in any situation, there's that piece of it, but there's also a chance for that person to be more than a victim. There's a chance for them to be a hero or a leader, to be able to step up, to take control of the situation. And I'll kind of make that real for you today, is going back to the student loan crisis, is before, if you were looking in Rousseau's thought, you're thinking, okay, this is a horrible thing that has happened to this person who made these bad decisions, or maybe their parents did, and they took out all this debt, and now they don't know how to pay it off. What can we possibly do to help them? And then you look at it from Burke's point of view of, yes, okay, that's something they didn't need to do. However, if we simply just pay for all of their student loans, they miss the chance to be able to take ownership of this situation and to be able to do something different for themselves the next time they're faced with a crisis, as well as for their kids. Because if you sit here and say, okay, we're going to pay for all of their student loans, what happens when they hit mortgage crisis? What happens when they hit a healthcare crisis? What happens if they have huge credit card debt? If they've never had a chance to be able to take ownership of this situation, to be more than a victim, and to be able to overcome it, then how are they ever going to escape what caused them to be in this situation in the first place? And so with Burke, it's a mix. Victim is part of it. So yeah, maybe sometimes people need some help, but it can't be all of it. And that's how he goes back and forth, approaching every situation. So look at a couple of the comments that came in. So Miguel says, the issue with denying the state of nature theory is that these were just posited as a way of discussing human nature. Discussing human nature as a foundational idea seems important for political philosophy. Kind of, Miguel. So you're right in that both Rousseau and Hobbes, Locke, all of these guys said, okay, we're going to look at this just as a thought experiment. Whether it happened, whether it didn't happen, we're not so sure, but it's going to tell us, it's going to give us prescription for today to be able to access human nature. What Burke would say is that it's not going to get you any closer to understanding human nature. In fact, it's going to take away from actually trying to understand it, because human nature is already apparent to us today. So Burke would say we don't need state of nature theory, Miguel, because we are human beings. You can look inside of yourself. You can look at the interactions that you've had. You can discuss with people who are flesh and blood today. You have a sample size that exists, as well as the treasure trove of history that we already have. Burke was very big on history and tradition, not from a standpoint of, hey, we have to do this, we have to follow these things simply because they exist. No, he said this is our sample size to look at so that we don't have to resort to state of nature. So we can see human nature over time through recorded history and be able to learn from it and apply it to be able to sort out the good and the bad. What Burke would say is that it's not a useful exercise, because now all of a sudden these fantasy lands that we've created to try to access human nature have no empirical or no validation. There's no way to actually ascertain if they occurred or not. They're simply within the mind of Rousseau or Locke and Hobbes. And so Burke would say, let's look at what's going on right here, right now, today, and what's happened recently up to this point, to be able to make those distinctions. And so that's where he's coming at. That's why a lot of people look at Burke and they say, this was a guy who was against abstraction. He was against these ideas, and how that relates, right? So take communism, for example, right? Communism is based upon the belief that the proletariat are victims. The working class are victims. These are people who have had horrible things happen to them, and they are not at fault. The bourgeoisie, right, was a Marxist term. The business class, these people are horrible. They're the oppressors who are attacking the victims. That was the kind of the communist idea, which you can see has some relationship to Rousseau in terms of victims versus oppressors. And the notion with Karl Marx is if we simply got rid of the oppressors and the business class, the proletariat take over, we would be able to shut down all the factories because no one would need them anymore. We would be able to shut down the governments, all this type of things, because we would live in paradise. We'd have some type of utopia that he envisioned abstractly, and it's going to be awesome. And we're never going to need these controls in our society again. Because Karl Marx was basing his belief off of abstractions, off of theories in his head. Now, when you actually go out into the world, you actually spend time in a factory, you spend time in the business, or you see that there's good managers and there's bad. There's good workers and there's bad. The more you experience the actual sophistication and complexity of human nature, you realize that there's good and evil within every person, and just getting rid of one class is not going to solve it. We do this on the right, frankly. On the conservative side, we do this all the time, is we paint every politician as if they are evil by nature. And then we want to give every business owner a pass. We want to give ourselves a pass and say, listen, people just need to follow the will of the people and get rid of the politicians. Well, that ignores the fact that there have been good politicians in the world. There has been George Washington, John Adams, Abraham Lincoln, Ronald Reagan. All of these politicians over time in our history, not to mention others, who did have a sense of statesmanship and civic virtue and did good things that we have benefited from. And when we castigate them entirely as this class that we hate, we're actually falling into some of Rousseau's thinking. You see this in the libertarian side. They do all of government, or they want the majority of it to be shut down. And then it gets into what part can you retain? And do you apply that same scope to business class? Do you recognize that there are good business leaders, and there's actually many bad ones too? There are people who will prey on you. There are people who will mislead you, tell you lies, try to get away with it, cover up where their money's going, what they're selling, all this type of thing. And so Burke gives us a way to be able to handle that complexity and to step away from stereotypical, simple, abstract arguments that are never going to work in practice. And that's why I love him. So that's the difference between these two guys. If you've got more questions on this stuff, if you want me to go into more detail on it, let me know. If there's other thinkers that you want me to wrestle with, we can. Miguel or others, if you want to talk more state of nature theory, we can definitely do that. I'm happy to do it with almost any philosopher that you want to bring up. Now, don't forget our YouTube channel and then our website, The Burke Conservative. You won't see the interview with Don on the YouTube channel, but you will see it on his. If you want a link to that, take a look at my Twitter. I have it on there. The website, we can post it on that for sure, but you'll also see the shows that we do here on those. So thanks again for watching. Let me know what you want us to get into on this Wednesday night show. I love doing it. It's a great chance to be able to talk, to be able to get these theories out, to get into deeper content, or really anything that you guys want me to get into. So thanks for watching, and I will see you next week.